Hello, hello. Are you out there? Some news came in over the transom this morning that my hometown of Santa Cruz finally decriminalized the psychedelic plants. And of course yeah. And we're the home of maps, so it took them a while. Of course, they got it wrong. You know, fungi are not plants. So my journey with these elixirs, as I call them, so I think it's in a sense, I'm trying to promulgate this term, and maybe Mark here in the audience, we're the old timers here from the 90s. When Terence McKenna was around, we hung out around with Terence McKenna. In fact, both Mark and I had a very distinct relationship with Terence that was quite beautiful. And we were both at the last conference for Terence. It was called Alchemical Arts. It was in Kona, Hawaii in September of 1999, and it was a goodbye. We were saying goodbye. It was very emotional, actually. But it was the Alex and Allison Gray and Robert Venosa was there, and numerous, the Shulgins, I think, were there. I'm not sure. But Terence was on his way out. He had a glioblastoma multiforme, which is a very large brain tumor. And it could have had something to do with his plasticity of his mind in the 90s, because these tumors, my sister died of one of them, they grow slowly. And so it only became apparent to him in May of that year when he had a grand mal seizure. And Christy had to drag him into the pickup truck and get him off the mountain. It was really something else. We were at his house in February of 1999 to do something called the Virtual Alchemical Powwow, which you can still find video online. We had a virtual world, which was my bailiwick at the time, and Mark's too, where we had online 3D spaces inhabited by beings, by people in Avatar, like Second Life and multiplayer gaming, etc. And Terence was fascinated by this. So because it was a invisible landscape made with language, right? And if you listen to Terence's raps, this is what he was all about. So a group of us convened at his house with his son Finn, and his son built the hyperboreal gate, basically to take the trip. And an artist in early 3D worlds built a world called Pollen, which was a DMT-inflected world. Terence arrived and dropped into the world as a bug-eyed green lawnmower and quickly changed to the alien, which he named Zone Ghost. And later on, I came into a collection of his personal letters that were sent over the years. Most of his archives were destroyed in a fire in 2007, so we lost the elves took the incriminating evidence. But these papers survived, and we're going to put them online, actually. But they're personal letters over about 15 years, and one from the early 90s, just as the information superhighway was coming, said, "I want to be a zone ghost of cyberspace." And so when he was able to choose that avatar, that gray alien avatar, he named it Zone Ghost. And 6 months later, we're with him at the end of the Alchemical Arts Conference. And we all laid down on the floor. Mark will remember this. So Constance Demby played her space bass. We laid down on the floor, and we could do anything we wanted. We could say goodbye to Terence. We could take a nap. We could do what we wanted to do. And Terence sat in the middle of the room. And what happened for me is what I call an endo trip, an endogenous trip, which I've been doing since I was a little kid. I think all little kids endo trip, and we can talk more about that later. I popped into this green plane in this virtual world, a lot like Alpha World. Mark will remember that first user-built space. And I was popped in there as an observer, and then I heard a whirring sound. I was crossed over, I was gone. And a whirring sound, and I looked up. It's kind of like looking up into the light here in this temple, and there was this dot, this effervescent dot coming down. And it was whirring, like whir, 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 and it came down, And it was this egg, glistening egg with these jewels on the side. And then I looked down, and it was aiming at this. There was a dude sitting there. It was Terence on his haunches, all just sort of folded up, just sitting on the way he would sit when he was smoking. He would sit like this on his haunches. And this thing was aimed at this guy, and this guy is sort of looking up, and this whirring egg, and I realized it was the bejeweled Fabergé egg mobile. It was like a limousine or something. And in the front was this curving glass screen with an unseen driver, and there was a plush seat in the back. It landed next to Terence, and he sort of unfolded himself. He stepped into the back seat. It sort of bounced a little bit, and then it took off through the azure veil. You know, it was gone. And by the way, he lit up a joint on the way up, just to be in full character. So then, this is pretty remarkable. That's what popped into my endo trip as soon as my head hit the carpet. And then, so the saying goodbye to Terence, and we all said goodbye that afternoon. It was the last time I would ever see him. I told him this. I said, Terence, I need to tell you what downloaded. And I told him this story, and he said, the getaway car. So we kind of, in a way, we committed Terence to cyberspace, and you'll find lots of audio and stuff online we recovered from cassette tapes. You remember cassette tapes? You've ever seen one? Because his entire vocal library was on these things called cassette tapes. There was no digital video going on or anything. But we put him back together, Humpty Dumpty, so that you could have this man's voice and his thinking. And that sort of landed me in really fascination with the psychedelic movement. I came into Timothy Leary's papers years later, his news archive, his records, and his library, because I was the agent for his family. And we placed the manuscripts at the New York Public Library in 2011, and then they donated everything else, and sitting in my barn. It's a phenomenal collection of tens of thousands of stories. And so that's all getting put together. So that's kind of a bit of background. A little bit more background of me. I avoided, like the plague, I avoided any kind of medication, let alone stronger things like you are interested in, until I was 37, because I found that I took a single aspirin or anything, it messed up my endo-tripping machinery that powered on when I was about 8 or 9, when I would close my eyes after a very stimulating day, and I would see these flashes, color flashes. I don't know if you remembered it. Does this happen to anybody here? That you're like, oh, there's a whole lot of shit going on, and you open your eyes and your brother's not shining the flashlight in your face. It's coming from inside. It's a light from within. And I thought, this is cool. And this is 1970. And we didn't have a color TV, but our neighbors did. But these color flashes behind closed eyelids were brighter than their color TV, their terrible Viking color TV. So what I then did was, when I was 10 or 11, learned how to dial my consciousness off, turn it off, no thinking, no worrying, whatever, so that that screen would grow. The screen would go whoop and come into focus. But I had to be the most delicate little observer sphere to do that trick. But when I nailed it, the fractal washes slowed, and it converted into colors, and then creatures, and then worlds. And then I just, boom, I'm traveling. And that was my practice, and it has led to all the work that you're about to see. So I came up with a name for it about 5 years ago, endo-tripping, as opposed to exo-tripping, where you take something in. And you can, of course, they're really marriages of the same thing, right? Exo elixirs are stimulating endo response, because the trip is made within you. Now, we don't know if when you're in, Terence would talk about starships from Zebul Ganubi and things that were beyond his comprehension as a human being. Now, where does that come from? Later in the talk, I'll tackle that. So this is going to be an audacious 2-part, with a break, romp through a bunch of stuff. So what we're going to do is take you through the most dialed in, screwed down, bolted down, reductionist science, right? Geologists, they're very grounded people. Chemists, they're super habituated people, right? They're not woo. They don't even have t-shirts that say no woo. I mean, they're just simply, there's no woo in them, right? But in order for their fields to make progress, they need the mystical side. And they're always looking around for it. Where's our Francis Crick? Where's Einstein? Because they're so dialed in and they're technical geniuses at perfecting proof, but they can't go above that. Their culture doesn't allow them to go up to the plane and zoom around in crazy space and come up with the big solution. So I realized early on that I was more comfortable in crazy space. I could do the bolted down stuff, but I could communicate the crazy vision to them in a bolted down language, and they could land it on the earth. And that I could travel what I called the transom of the liminal, which is from magic. You can swing over here to the mundane, and not that the mundane is mundane. You know, it's just the world, the down state. Bring the magic in there, recast it, go back and take mundane problems into the magic and say, here, over to you, figure it out. And so at the end, the second half is all going to be about that. It's all going to be about the mystic. The first half is going to be about the bolted down mundane. So hopefully it will satisfy both your cravings, because we all want, you know, bolted down. And every once in a while, then we really want to soar into the magic. And maybe it will show you how you can do both. And I think in this time of climate shocks that are coming, we need to have all the tools online. We need to have the best mundane, bolted down science and data, and we need to have total visionary sense to redo the narrative of humanity. We have to bypass and basically ameliorate the effects of all this crazy story that's coming our way, because we have to kind of push that off this way and create a new story. And I'm going to cover how we might do that after the break. So how's that sound to everybody? Is that good? Okay. So I just threw some slides in at the last minute, realizing I'm in Australia and I've got to land it here. And the science that I'm about to show you started here. Started in this crazy island here on some planet somewhere. So since I was 14, I was working on the challenge or the problem or the puzzle of the origin of life. And we had some breakthroughs, visionary download breakthroughs in 2013, which I'll tell you about a bit later. But the real putting it together came on a trip up to the Port Hedland area in WA. I'll just show you where we went. So we flew up to Carnarvon. We went down into Shark Bay. Has anybody been to Shark Bay? It's an amazing place. I mean, all Australians ought to go to WA. It's like for Canadians, we go to the Arctic. It's our wilderness. But WA is just amazing, amazing state. So here we are at Shark Bay, and what's in Shark Bay are these things that they used to think were rocks. They're sort of sticking up, and they have spongy surfaces on the top, and they're called stromatolites. And they grow, so it's microbial mat that's growing there, and then when tides push sand over top of them, they have to cement the sand together like a good construction crew and then grow on top of that, because otherwise they lose access to sunlight. And so they grow these layers and layers up to 9 meters they've been found. Immense structures are grown. And they lay down the oldest fossil evidence for life on probably Earth or any planet are stromatolites. So there I am. We actually snorkeled with the stromatolites. They generate oxygen in vast quantity. So if you put your finger on them, they're squishy. They're alive. So then what we did is we took this crazy bus truck thing up to this area called the Pilbara, to this particular zone, let's see if this is going to work, called the North Pole Dome. And it's so remote they called it the North Pole. But there's one little mine site right here called the Haoma Mining Camp. And we get permits to go in through into this area and do geology, do field work. There's our bus, there's our utes. It's the only time I've driven a ute. That was because I thought I would be a hazard to the nation of Australia, driving this thing with a 15-foot flag on the back so the mine trucks can see you. And I'm driving along, and there's only one other vehicle, and it only uses the road once a week. And it's a road train that weighs 80 ton, and it has full of barite, and I encountered it that one day. I heard the rumbling. You could see the jet contrails as this road train is coming. And I ditched the ute off before he came over the rise, because the spray of stone would break every window. And I looked, and it was the son of the barite mine owner. And later on, I met him at the Ironside pub in Marble Bar. He said, "You almost gave me a bloody heart attack." You know, because there were no other vehicles there. He's driving maximum speed, the heaviest vehicle on the planet. But it was me, you know, of course it had to be me. So this is the geology of North Pole Dome, and this is what they find all over the Pilbara. These are the ancient stromatolites. This one's about 2.5 billion years old. Layer, 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 layer. Here's some domical ones seen from the top. Here's a cross section. They're just all over the place. The most ancient landscape in the world, there's little stromatolites in between chert. There they are there. And inside this chert, if you slice 10,000 sections, you might find a microfossil. That's new science. There's Martin van Kranendonk from UNSW. So UNSW is the leaders in the world in this area. There's the little layers. There I am with the stroms. So what they found at the same time as my colleague Dave DAMER and I were proposing the model for how life can start on Earth in a hot spring that's fluctuating, our colleagues at UNSW discovered this. Tara Jokic, a young undergraduate, ran into a gold orb spider web one night as she was trying to get out of a sampling site, turned around. It forced her to turn around because she was like, "Oh no." And then she went back to the site and realized that the strange thing she had seen, this curling barite, was strange, and she took a sample. And the sample changed the world. It was this. It's literally evidence of a hot spring with splashing geysers making something called geyserite. And when we put our theory together with their geology, it rocked the world. And I'll show you more about that later. So that's a little bit of an Aussie preamble as to why it's so sweet to come and present this visionary science to you here, because it really is based, it's sourced here. And nearby where that geology is done is Gallery Hill. And we went to Gallery Hill, which is the largest petroglyph in the world. It's thousands of individually pounded in petroglyphs in desert varnish on this enormous rock mound. It has the oldest petroglyphs, the stick figures with the string that they think are 70,000 years old, and it has the full rainbow serpent there, a two-headed rainbow serpent there, beautifully pounded into the desert varnish. So if you're ever up in WA and try to get to this place, it's like a holy spot. Almost no one ever goes there. So all of that landed it, in a sense, in the country and the people, because it's all for them about ancestry. So there we were in the Pilbara, trying to find the deepest common ancestor of us all. And when I go to New Zealand on Sunday, we're going to New Zealand to work with Maori in the hot springs in Rotorua to do chemistry, and you'll see that later. All about, they're very into this, like discovering how the ancestor emerged. And they're very big into these hot springs, so it's cool for them. And it's a wonderful partnership with the Maori, doing the science with them. So all that, so the first two little topics was origins and humans. And I'm going to use a lot of nerd metaphors because we're all nerds now, right? We've all been assimilated. You know, you're all assimilated. Yeah, it looks like it. So you're all assimilated into tech. So it's a whole new, almost philosophical approach that you can take. Because for thousands of years, humans have struggled with, like, we describe it in terms of people. God's a guy with a big beard, and heaven is this place that kind of looks like the Irish fairyland. Oh, okay, we'll do that. Now we can describe everything in terms of apps, operating systems, services, right? The tech of psych. And that's a kind of a new thing, and I call it God for geeks. So we'll get into that in the second half. But in order to understand maybe what God is, or the field, or the luminous space, or the numinous space even, we have to understand where we came from. So if you'll bear with me, I want to take you through the bootstrapping of life on Earth, and then the all-important bootstrapping of humans, which I call snapping pixels. The origin of the visionary state itself. Where did that come from? Because that's a teaching we can learn from our ancestors that will show us how to go into the future. So it's like visiting Gallery Hill as an Aboriginal community. That was a teaching place for them. Or for now, we go to Burning Man, or we go to Rainbow Serpent, and that's a teaching place for us. So without further ado, does this make sense? Does it look juicy to everyone? Okay. Bootstrapping us.
Hey, let's get the samples in.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, let's take another measurement.
The laws of chemistry and physics are universal. So it's a given that when we go to another Earth-like planet with water, with the sorts of minerals that we have here, an iron core, an atmosphere, it's inevitable that this kind of simple chemistry would have been present. Okay, it's 15 degrees up here. Let's see what this little guy has for us. As long as there's a chance for energy to interact with that mixture, things will happen. Wow, look at that.
1 degree, keep pulling up.
The question that we're heading for right now, how certain can we be that that mix of simple chemistry could take the next step in complexity? So life could begin.
In the hydrothermal fields of Bumpers Hill, California, all the ingredients of life are brought together. Water, carbon molecules, energy, minerals.
Careful of the end not coming off.
Biologists David DAMER and Bruce Damer believe this is the kind of environment where life could get started on another world.
Bubbling pools, strange colored rocks, water of different pHs, all kinds of flows and dynamics, steam rising. It looks like nature's chemistry set. And it's an engine, an actual engine for the beginning of a living system.
Conditions like this defined the early Earth. Evidence of similar environments has been found on Mars, and researchers expect hydrothermal fields to be a common feature of Earth-like exoplanets. But how might nature's chemistry set cook up the recipe of life?
Everything that's alive is in fact based on polymers. Everybody knows the name DNA, nucleic acid, that's one of the polymers. Proteins, these are amino acid polymers, and that's basically the start of all life, are those two polymers. So what we're doing is taking small molecules, the pieces of a polymer, called monomers in fact, and we're exposing them to energy, such as you see here at Bumpus Hill, and seeing where that energy is sufficient to make those monomers link up one after another to make a polymer. And in fact, if we can make a protein-like molecule and a nucleic acid-like molecule and put it into a little wrapper, a compartment, we're on the way. We call those protocells.
Each sample contains organic molecules, or monomers, exposed to the mineral-rich steam and heat energy of the fumarole in an attempt to form a protocell.
We think that drying out, such as you see all around us here at Bumpus Hill, water coming in, then drying out, coming in, drying out, that's a cycle. We think that that cycle was very important to drive the process by which polymers are synthesized and then accumulate. Let's go for it. Failure.
Are you sure?
Yeah, there's nothing left.
Put it down here to
Yeah.
The first experiment fails, just as it would do many times on an Earth-like exoplanet. But if all the elements were present in conditions such as this experiment in life would repeat again and again.
But some of them got a lot of liquid in them.
That's one last try. Given enough time, and keep in mind, we have an entire planet with lots of volcanic land masses coming up, with lots of puddles like this trying to learn how to become alive. Mostly it's failures, but it would only take a few successful protocells that happen to be able to survive and had learned how to make more of themselves. So go ahead and get them into the boxes.
Is the universe made to make life? This is a huge question that's sort of beyond the scope of perhaps humans to be able to answer. But what we can observe is everything comes down to cycling. It comes to rhythms and overlapping rhythms and patterns. And it's almost as though if you get the right cycling and patterning in a system, it learns how to do that itself and how to lift itself into being. And so perhaps that's the closest metaphor that we know, that the geology gave us that ability. The moon going around the earth gave us tides. The rotation of the earth gives us days and nights. Rainfall into these hydrothermal fields gives us geysers that are periodic. And life still follows rhythmic patterns. That's the clue we have. So perhaps it's the universal harmonic that creates life. So that's what we do. We literally go into these fields and we try the chemistry. And our colleagues just don't ever do that. They want to be in a white lab coat and using glassware and buy everything from a catalog. And so this is the pioneering work that Dave DAMER and I've done from UC Santa Cruz, and we're about to do it again in Rotorua next week. And do 400 experiments in the hot springs at Hell's Gate. So why are we doing this? It's because back in 1871, Charles Darwin wrote in a very famous paragraph to a letter to his friend Joseph Hooker, where he coined this very famous phrase that probably all of you know. But if, and what a big if we could conceive in some warm little pond somewhere with all sorts of ammonia, phosphoric salts, light, heat, etc., and this is his proposal for how life began, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. And he nailed it for the 21st century. He's describing what your body does when you eat lunch, breaks down, then your body's using those breakdown products to form building blocks to build up your RNA, DNA, and proteins to keep your cells going and to make the cell walls. That's how life works. It forms these compounds and gets them to be more complex in the presence of water, which breaks them down. So it's called away from equilibrium chemical system. So that was our takeoff point for our science. Let's show Darwin's intuition. Let's show a place where that works. So our field went down a bunch of interesting cul-de-sacs or rabbit holes for 125 years. This famous primordial soup. You know, you can get the Campbell's soup can that says primordial soup on it. That was JBS Haldane and the Russian scientist Oparin, which they faithfully recognized that you had to get things into a pot and get them to interact. Then in the most famous science horror film experiment of all time, the spark chamber, right? Harold Leary and Stan Miller, this is Stan Miller here, sparked an atmosphere and precipitated out about 100 amino acids from scratch. And that was a worldwide phenomenon. That when that story came out, it's like origin of life discovered. You know, that's always the story, and it's always not true. But a major piece was discovered at the same year that Watson and Crick published the structure of DNA. And then in 1977, another one of our colleagues, Jack Corliss, using the Alvin submersible, discovered hydrothermal vents in the ocean. These black smokers and white smokers and whatnot. And then later on proposed that maybe life could start there. And that actually pulled our field down a rabbit hole, down for 35 years of millions of dollars of research that produced nothing in the end that had anything to do with the origin of life. And when I came into the field 10 years ago, I looked at it with Dave and I said, wow, they're trying to do chemistry under a mile-high water column in the ocean, expecting things to form and not break down. It's just implausible. I said, how can this be? And well, the chemists think it won't work, but the geochemists love it because it's hot water and rock. And so it really depended on your field if you loved this or not. So what Dave and I have done is to haul the community back onto the pools on land in the last 4 or 5 years, pretty much. And in a sense, the discovery in Australia here of the geyserite, 3.5 billion year old, full of evidence for a living microbial community, has helped immensely. So this is geyserite. This is 3.5 billion years old. This is a sample I picked up in the Pilbara, which has little nodules, and these are stromatolites. Another one I picked up 3 years ago, which is lakeshore stromatolite. Muddy, stinky mats at a lakeshore 2.7 billion years ago. And if you go down to further down to Shark Bay, you see the real thing living today. So the rock record built the evidence. In science, in physics, you can have a theory like Einstein's general or special relativity, and it can be proven in one shot with the 1919 eclipse that was photographed. But in this field, it's much harder. Physics is relatively easy compared to this. We don't have $1 billion to build a cyclotron, but the problem we're trying to solve is much more complex than physics. So the only way that you can do that is to compose a hypothesis and then test it over years to generations and build weight of evidence. And then one day in the 21st century, humanity might say, we think we know how we began. So that's my part of the relay race, is to do that. So where we think we know we began is in a little pool like this, 4 billion years ago, driven by geysers, down an outflow channel, full of organics from space that were delivered from meteorites. And on the very edge of the pool, in this little area here, are wet-dry cycles. And a bathtub ring will form where the chemistry can happen. So let's look a little deeper into that. So the pools on land have all these great properties. Some of the pools can have what's called the Goldilocks chemistry. You know, the Goldilocks zone they talk about in astrobiology, where it's like the porridge is not too hot, not too cold, just right. So planets can be that way. They can be just in the right temperature to maintain liquid water so that they can harbor life. So there can be a Goldilocks pool. And into this Goldilocks pool through time, things can happen. So you can collect stuff falling in from the atmosphere, from volcanic clouds, from meteorites, from little dust particles from the solar system, accumulate, concentrate enough to make chemistry happen, and then get cycled somehow. Remember in the film they talked about the importance of cycling. Well, geysers create cycling. And then once you've formed an early form of life, it can spread to other pools and lakes and streams and develop more robustness, and then share that robustness with other little colonies and go back and forth. So the landscape is a fitness landscape. So the engine's secret, we reproduced this in the lab 6 years ago. What we did was we built a little chamber. It's in here. A little disc goes around, and we put little glass dishes, and the dishes can be filled with water and the building blocks of life, the building blocks of RNA, of an important polymer, and this lipid, this little fatty stuff, kind of like cream in your coffee. And then the dishes would go around here, and they would get hydrated here and dehydrated there, and they would go around and around and around. And it worked. We thought, well, we can build this like a hot spring in the lab, and what it does, I'll just bring everything up at once. It actually, and this is the geekiest slide, so do not panic. There will be no math later and no test. What happens when you dry the dish down, you get this film of like bathtub ring of lipids, of these fatty things that we know came from space and that now make up all your cell walls. They're called phospholipids, but the primitive lipids form these bathtub rings, and in between them, they stitch together the polymers of life, DNA, RNA, and proteins, on their own, without having a machine to do it, because your body is like got machines like, you need DNA copied, I'll handle that. I'll split it apart and I'll copy it. But before life, there were no machines to do it. So we figured that nature's only way to make all these polymers was wet-dry cycling. And these are what's called the gel results of all our products. And this is a nanopore sequencer, which we invented to pull the RNA through a pore and count the bases. It's now $1 billion industry, Dave's company. So I started getting nervous about all this as we were doing this in the lab. Yep.
What was the atmosphere at that time?
There was no oxygen, free oxygen, so it would have been CO2, nitrogen, those sorts of things. It's not exactly known, but in our chamber, what we do is pump out all the oxygen, because oxygen gets in the way of things. That's why you probably can't have a second origin of life starting. Yeah, it's a good question. So I was sitting in the front row of a conference in Japan, and one of our vociferous geologists, who always is in the front row asking questions, he asked the hardest questions. He said, your thing will never work. You'll never form these protocells in silicious or acidic pools because of blah, 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 blah. It will never work. And his name was Steve, and I thought, okay, I'll have lunch with this guy. I had lunch with the guy. So instead of ignoring his challenge, engage. Because I have nothing to lose. They can't fire me or hire me. I have no position, anywhere. So I had lunch with Steve, and I said, what do you mean we can't form the little protocells? He said, well, here's all the chemistry won't work. I said, okay, I'm going to take all the stuff, and I'm going to go to Yellowstone National Park with a field season, and we went to this hot spring, took water, put it in the vial with the components, and formed protocells that were stable. And we did 100 of these, different combinations. Took them back from Yellowstone and put them under the microscope. And yes, folks, they're stable in acidic and alkaline water with DNA. They can trap DNA. And then here, we took some ocean water to compare, and it just crystallizes. So this is another argument for why life can't start in the ocean. If you try to wash your hands with soap in the ocean, it turns to curds, right? So life needs compartments to get going. It needs what are called protocells. And so I sent the draft paper to Steve, and he's one of these guys that gets up at 4 in the morning, right? And he sent me an email back at 6 in the morning, said, I read your paper 5 times. I'm freaking impressed. No one's ever taken my challenge and gone and tried to prove me wrong, and you did. And now in geochemistry, we're going to ask the question, how on earth did this work? And they worked out it was ionic components in the hot spring. It was like no one saw that coming. And so now it's an entire branch of this type of geochemistry. Very cool. So this is New Zealand we're doing next week.
It's just a case of weird science. Leading American scientist Dr. Bruce Damer is at Rotorua's Hell's Gate, conducting research trials aiming to answer the age-old question, how did we get here?
It's very exciting. It's 21st century science, revolutionary science to watch. If we can find this cycle, it's the engine of creation, effectively. Also that we came not from an individual, not from competing individuals, but from a network, a collaborative community was at the tap root of the tree of life.
Dr. Damer's research could turn previous origins of life science on its head. He's testing whether hot springs on land may have been the starting point for life itself. Dr. Damer's searching for RNA, a nucleic acid, and the basis of all living cells.
So what we think is that RNA could have been the first polymer that life synthesized first at random in a process like this, and then picked through selection, through these cycling protocells, which we're doing here in the hot spring, picked ones that worked.
For years, scientists had accepted the theory that life began in hydrothermal vents in the ocean. Charles Darwin once speculated that biological molecules might form in a warm little pond, and Dr. DAMER believes this to be much closer to the truth.
If we can show to our colleagues and to the world that we can self-assemble an important biopolymer of life called RNA in a hot spring pool that's cycling, in the conditions that would have been around in the early Earth on these big volcanic islands, our colleagues are really going to seriously look at doing more experiments. And it'll create a whole movement, a whole sort of paradigm shift in origin of life thinking, back to Darwin's warm little pond, only now it's a cycling hot little pool.
Jaden McLeod, Local Focus.
So what I was holding in my hand was a stromatolite that was growing in a nearby hot spring in Rotorua that had grown in days with silica coming out of solution and the microbes in it. It's still happening now. And they form structures that look exactly like the ones in the Pilbara 3.5 billion years ago. That's the constancy of the microbial world. We arose from that world. We're complex beings that popped out of the microbial mat. But the microbial mat is the ground of life and being on this planet, and it will outlive us all the way to the heat death of the Earth. So when you can form these protocells, and these are the ones from New Zealand, you get a natural roulette wheel. So the only way to start life is to, if you don't have a creator, is to literally create a gazillion experiments and subject them to this huge roulette wheel. And the ones that are stable and robust go into the next experimental turn, and the next one, and the next one. And that's how life can get started. That's how we still exist. You know, life still works that way. It's a huge, randomized, in some sense, turning of a wheel through populations. So, because you're all card-carrying nerds, I want to give you a metaphor, and the metaphor comes from way back. See, Mark and I are so old that we remember things called punched cards and punched paper tape, which is before you had a terminal where you could see characters. The only way you could load a program into simpler computers was with punched paper tape. And this is how Microsoft started, selling punched paper tapes of their basic language for the Altair computer. And I have a barn full of vintage computers, and one of them is this guy here, the Altair 8800 kit computer. And so I had a dream one night of like, how do I explain the origin of life to nerds? Well, how about, can you write programs without a programmer? So creationist nerds, right? I could make a logical argument to them. And here it is. So a random paper tape puncher, instead of a Paul Allen punching out the paper tape to load BASIC into the Altair, it's a random program. And it goes into the Altair, feeds the computer is fed by an energy source, goes into the simple processor, and the program runs, and it's random, right? What happens with random programs? They mostly crash, right? They're just like gobbledygook. And so they go into the crash trash, but maybe program A ran. Now, what does it mean to run? In this computer, did it turn on a diode on the front of the panel, like lit up a light, blinking lights? So if program, and that's the simple test, like program A turned on a light, it gets fed back into the puncher, and a new program gets added onto it. And then the longer program runs, and most of them crash, and then one of them turns on 2 lights. So it gets selected. And before long, maybe a long time, but not in the geological time frame, you have a program that will flash all the lights that no one wrote. And it has a weird kind of spaghetti-like structure, but it works. Programming without a programmer. Now, if those programs could also influence the hardware, you could evolve new computers over time. There's an IBM PC of Mark and my youth. Here's a initial Toshiba laptop of 1992, and then the thing you're holding today. The evolution of hardware and software together, right? Even a creationist geek would have to say, yeah, sounds plausible. So where do you find this in nature? This very same system? you find the polymerizer is the punching paper tapes out of the building blocks that are coming from space and landing on the land in little pools. We now know that when solar systems form, they're packed full of organics, and they rain down and they get stitched together in the little pools. So the programmed paper tapes are polymers by their gazillion. The computer is Charles Darwin's warm little cycling pool, driven by energy. The programs are protocells, i.e. a little bubble with a polymer in it. And they either crash or they pass. And that's due to natural selection. And what that means in this simple world is that the bubbles pop or they do not. So if they pop, the polymers are gone. If they don't, they go around another time. Simple as can be. Evolution of hardware and software together for the origin of life. So it's a wheel. Everything comes down to cycling. The dry layer, and this is what it looks like under the microscope, stitches polymers together. When you put a drop of fluid into that dish, it buds off gazillions of compartments with the polymers, and you can see them stained here. They're tested for, like, can they stay together? And then the ones that stay together, like this one here, maybe is a little tighter, it's like got a zipper around here. The polymer's doing something with the membrane. So it delivers them back here. See all the purple ones? They're back. The ones that we stained. And that they form this sludge. We come from something, a very unimpressive sludge probably. It'll win the Ig Nobel Prize one day. And this little sludge and this cycle represents what's called a kinetic trap that cycles polymers and gets them to grow and grow and grow and more complex, just like Charlie Darwin asked for. And that this little unit here may be the common ancestor of us all, this sludge, this collection of protocells. More on that in a bit. So put it all together so your brain doesn't blow up. This is our complete model in one diagram. So you have synthesis of stuff in the solar system, accumulation of all of it on the early Earth, in the little ponds. You see on the thing on the left, it makes your organics and it makes your little protocells. You get into a cycling pool, and then you power up an engine that lifts a non-living being called a protocell into a more living thing called a progenote into life itself, an engine that is turning and turning. And then those sludges flow out of the pool, and now they have to learn how to eat sunlight because they don't have the chemicals to feed on anymore. And that's the same thing in Yellowstone today. They're either feeding on chemicals or they're feeding from the sky. So that's what happens there. And once they learn how to feed from sunlight, you've really crossed into the living world. They're autonomous. They can live a lot of places, and they flow into streams, and they flow down toward the ocean. So they adapt to salt water, form those things that you see in Shark Bay. We'll see that's the hot spring evidence, the lakeshore evidence, and then the seashore evidence. And so it all comes together into one landscape, geological setting and whatnot. So that is, and then all of this is the roots of the tree of life. So you hear about the trunk of the tree of life being like common ancestors and things. This is the roots, the tangled bank, the tangled web of interconnections that led to a robust cell going forward. What are the implications for this? Well, we developed the hypothesis. We published it in 2015. It got a lot of attention. It was on the cover of Scientific American. And then suddenly we were involved in the Mars program, because NASA's sending a new heavy rover. It's almost 2 tons, and it's launching in 6 months, called Mars 2020. And so I was invited to join the Mars landing site selection process. Why? Because we had a model for where on Mars life might start, and where to look for the evidence of it now. And so this is what the rover looks like. It's a copy of Curiosity, but it has a sample caching system. It comes down on a sky crane. And where we would like NASA to go, but they decided not to go, is back to Columbia Hills, where the Spirit rover turned up this white powder. And the white powder is not snow, it's opaline silica, which is it indicates there's a hot spring flowing there 3.7 billion years ago. And these little nodules on the surface could contain evidence for life if we can only get them back to the Earth. So it's an audacious project. This is the Spirit rover that found them. There's the nodules. And NASA decided not to go back to this site. They wanted to go to a new site, fair enough. So I flew to Japan last month to help the Japanese Space Agency with ideas to design a way to go to this site and get these rocks with our team. And it was really fun with young engineers, and origami swarms released into the atmosphere that then fly their way down, and they pick the rocks up and put them into a dish, and really fun. So hopefully that gets built by the 2030s. So there's the things we need to pick up, if you have any ideas. So what we're going to look for is something potentially like stromatolites. Here's more from the Pilbara. And there is the famous hot spring vein that Tara saw when she hit the spider web. That's what she came back for. So that's what we may be looking for on Mars. And there's a piece of it that I was allowed to take off-site that I still have, this very rare geyserite. So what about the search for life on other worlds outside the solar system? Well, here's one of the first Earth-sized planets found. This is an artist rendition, because we don't have pictures of that. That could hold life. But what about this one? Well, it's a little too close to the parent star. It's just be too hot. There'd be no liquid water. What about this crazy system? Look at this. This is called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It was discovered about 2 years ago. It's a tiny solar system. That's a red giant, a red dwarf rather. And this whole solar system and this tiny sun fits right in here. There's Mercury. It's way inside the orbit of Mercury. But it has these 7 planets, that at least 2 of which are in zones that could have liquid water. Super cool, right? But what do you need for life to start? And this is what now our work is informing people who think of where life could be in the cosmos. Could it start around a red dwarf? Is there enough energy? Is there enough liquid water there? What are the atmospheres composed of? What about the geology? Well, what we've come down to is a single sentence that you need to have polymers with encapsulation and combinatorial selection for life to start. No matter what chemistry you're proposing, no matter what world you're talking about, it's a single statement of how life can begin. So that's what's happened. And quick question. The NASA definition is kind of good. It's like a chemical system that's able to, subject to expresses Darwinian selection. So that's very vague and everything. But and there's many definitions for life. But this is our definition for how to start life from the basic components. So can life be here on Enceladus or Europa? And we propose not. When we guide NASA as far as the missions going to fly through the plumes in the Saturnian moon, Europa, we are predicting they'll find no biological molecules in that plume, that life can't start in the deep ocean because it can't go through wet-dry cycling. It can't get started in that environment thermodynamically. So is that a lot of nerding? Is that enough nerding? So it came to the public's attention in 2017 on the cover of Scientific American. And for philosophy, this is what started to happen. I thought I was done. My life's work that I started when I was 14 is done. Like, it's published, it's done, it's testing out. Other teams are starting to work with it. And then it came to me that there's something deep in the philosophy, that this little unit here, that we didn't come from a common ancestor in competition. We came from a common community. The only way for life to start is for these simple protocells to get snuggled together like you are here in this room and form a network of mutual sharing and strengths to survive. And I've started to realize this is as powerful an idea as relativity was for the 1920s. This is a powerful idea for the 2020s, that our deepest ancestor is a community, and that everything is communities, and that there is no individuals. Individuals are a thing that we made up. It's like Ram Dass, bless his soul, he's just passed, that he talks about the myth of separation. the kind of the trip of thinking you're separate from others is something made up in the human mentation. So now we're going to jump to the origin of us. You ready for that? And then we'll take our break. So origin stories are really important. There's origin stories in the psychedelic community. You know, there's Fitzhugh Ludlow and there's Albert Hoffman's bicycle ride. You know, these are origin stories. There's, at least from the white Western perspective, there's the trip to Mexico in 1954 with Wasson and that group that published in Life. They published the story. It's in my collection. It's like Life, May 1957. The discovery of mushrooms which give magical visions. That's on the cover of Life magazine in the middle of conservative America. And this story appears. And why does it appear? Because the owners of Collier's have been taking acid from the famous peanut butter jar that was making its rounds. And that in the 1950s, the intelligentsia had access to acid from Sandoz. And so John F. Kennedy and Cary Grant took zillions of acid trips, you know, and his acting changed. And all these like highfalutin people were taking acid. And so that was happening. So the publishers of Collier's said, hallucinogenic, you know, that was a new term. It was just being coined. We'll run the story in our Life magazine, the most impactful magazine in America. The story ran, and a young Terence McKenna, who was, 13 at the time. It's about that, I think 1946. Yeah, 13, 11. He was freaking only 11 years old. So he reads this article, and you can imagine like his eyes bug out of his head. Oh my God, I gotta get some of those, but I can't. And then he read a related article that morning glory seeds could get you access. And he was a super nerd visionary kid. He hung around with his uncle, and his uncle had a gem cutter. And so they used to go and get him, and Dennis would go find agates, and his uncle would put them in a tumbler, and then he'd slice them and polish them. And Terence would study, like, there's a world in there. There's a world outside the mundane surface. He was fascinated by the effervescent colors on butterflies and insects near Colorado, where he grew up. And so he was totally into this, and he saw this article. He saw the story about miscreants going to hardware stores and buying packets of morning glory seeds, and he rushed with his allowance down to the hardware store to get this package of morning glory seeds, went back home, chewed them down, fell into a huge reverie of nausea, which pretty much he passed out. I mean, you know what he was doing. He fell forward onto the lawn in the back of the house, and the hanging gardens of Babylon opened for him, like at 11 years old, and he was sold. So that's the origin story, one of the origin stories of psychedelia from the white Western people. So what about the origin story of humans, where we come from, with the particular slant of where the heck do these visions come from? How could Terence, like at 11, see, you know, creatures from Zebel Ganubi? Where did they come from? And how did his mind could operate as a computer 3D graphics renderer to render those scenes into his optical system with his eyes closed? Where'd this come from in evolution? If we can figure that out, we can figure a lot of things out. So here we go. So this came to me as a download about 6 years ago when there was an article published in Science about this, about a prosimian skeleton. And prosimians are the earliest common ancestors of primates, tarsies, you know, monkeys, everything. We all started as one little insectivore, about 2 inches long. You see this fellow, about 2 inches long, whiptail, and he's got his dinner in his hand, which is an insect. They're insect eaters. So, and these dudes were around before the dinosaur-killing asteroid, right? They were living in the rainforest before that. The dinosaurs are wiped out. The pterosaurs are no longer. And how did we survive? And that's the whole thing. How did prosimian mammals survive that when the entire planet turned into a firestorm? Like what's happening here in Australia, but planet-wide, within 24 hours, it was 500 degrees after that impact. everything burned, you know. But the biosphere recovered, and we had made it through. So they lived up here in the rainforest canopy, because if you were on the rainforest floor, you were an instant target for raptors. It's just instant popcorn for lunch. And they were communal. Aren't they cute? We were cute. We were all cute once. So these are tarsies from Madagascar, and they're kind of the closest model for us. So I went into one of my endotrip downloads. I was like, this is so cool. We are insectivores. What does this mean? Oh, boom. And so suddenly the endotrip starts happening. And I was thrown into a world where I was one of the prosimians in this ball. We were all grabbing onto each other at night for warmth. And I was in this ball, and I realized, oh, our strength is our body contact. That's one clue. So if we're touching, we're stronger. We are the prosimian. We are the progenote. We are the communal unit. So when you're sitting separately, not touching another, you have the myth of separation. That was an instant clue, like, oh, we got to get closer. But the second thing was I felt a wiggling. And what was happening was on the outside of the ball, a teenage prosimian, I called her Overdrive, for reasons you'll discover in a minute, was gently getting herself out of the ball. Everyone was sleeping. The ball was just sleeping. And she was creeping out onto the rainforest limb, like this, because what she saw on the limb at dawn, as Mark and I have both been to Peru, and you see these fantastic steam coming up over the jungle, and the steam lights up the trees. But what Overdrive was seeing was this globule of tree sap that had emerged overnight, because she knew that if she could get to that globule, she could take it down, it would turn her on. This happens for every animal. It's always after this, right? It's sort of a natural thing. So she goes to the globule. One eye, they have binocular vision, right? They're remarkable animals, even 90 million years ago. One eye is looking back to the community ball, because if they see her, they will bust her ass, because it's community property. And the other eye is looking toward the globule of tree sap at dawn, and she gets to it, purses her lips, and starts to suck it in. She takes it in. And as she takes it in, it's instant glucose, instantly going into her mind, and her mind turns on to a higher level of consciousness. And her eyes look up and see the stars, and her eyes look around, and she's turned on, because that's what she wanted. That's why she's called Overdrive. But her eyes then look forward and see a pattern of squares across the limb. It's sort of vague because it's the dawn, and then suddenly that pattern shifts. And she's like, huh? It's a curiosity. And then suddenly it dawns on her, it's danger. It's danger because it's this. Waiting for her for 70 million years was the great arch predator of all prosimians, tree snakes. And tree snakes evolved their patterns to mesmerize us, to trick us into going like, because this tree snake will have the head right under the limb where she's standing, and she either snaps to and jumps when the snake strikes, or she snapped down. So trillions of our deepest ancestors made that trip. They made trip out on that limb to find that elixir, to get turned on, to either be snapped to or snapped down. Because going for elixirs on your own, in your own quest, is highly risky, right? But you can bring back the pearls of evolution. So say she snaps to, runs back to the community ball, and procreates, and makes her double, and the double of her double, and the double of her double. And what that gives you over time is vision. See, we're always psychedelic. So it gives you more powerful vision, that you can determine more colors and faster and faster and faster and faster. It builds that visual cortex like nothing else would. That is the direct way that nature gave us vision. And it was a long period, but it grew and grew and grew until we have Ardipithecus walking in the rainforest using opposable thumbs. And then the savanna dries out, and then our kind is cast into another lifestyle. But now we carry in our craniums vision processing system like no other on any animal on the planet that can do this thing, all given to us by the serpent. And so whenever we're walking along, we see one of these things, what happens, right? You jump. It's programmed, hardwired into you. It's hardwired into every monkey or tarsus, or they go, whew, anything that looks like snake scales. So what does this allow us to do, though? We can do this. In the ancient world, we could create beauty, mosaics. We could build cities like this because of this processor that we have. We can do patterns. We can drive cars. We can read books. We can watch TV. We can make TV. We can create these worlds. But we came from this world, which we're now destroying. We're now taking down. And we're replacing with this world. A world of the emerald to the world of the azure. Glass and hard steel and what. You can see it all through Sydney, right? That's what they're building. Very, very cut. Every building looks like a freaking smartphone, right? And the apartments look like smartphones. So that's the reality we're creating. Our friend Charles Eisenstein wrote a book about this, how do we bring about a beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, right? I think part of the clue is to know where we came from. So where does this all really go to? Because these are sort of technical solutions. Yeah, we were trained by the snake. Yeah, we do this kind of thing. We're good at doing sort of stuff. But what really drives us as beings? Maybe that's the source of our vision, the origin of human vision. But what is the origin of how humans work as an operating system? I think there's a clue right in this sculpture by Chris DeCall. And it's this wooden man, but inside the man is a child crying. And I think that this is the clue to who we are and how we boot up. It's the inner children, the inner kindergarten. This is becoming a real thing now. So here's a sculpture at Burning Man. This is coming into our culture. I think Mark is nodding. He might have been there that year. So here's a two couple. They're not getting along. Like the outer personality is saying, I hate you. I'm not leaving, but I hate you. And at night, this is what you see. The inner children still love, right? So our culture is getting wise to this. Our culture is finally getting wise to this. But at the same time, as this has happened, the serpent is back. The serpent is back with a fury because we're the only species that can do this. Why? Because we were trained to track pixels in real time and to build models. We can use smartphones. Look at how tight the coil is around us. Look at how mesmerized we are. So the way that the serpent fed on prosimian bodies was to make us stop and stop breathing and go into a stasis. Then we became a prey animal for that serpent. Same thing can happen here. But what is happening? They're looking at news stories and clickbait and this and they don't like me and whatever. And we're holding our breath. And we're getting anxiety because we're being strangled by holding our breath because we're getting mesmerized by the same process that evolved us. And we're falling into despair, a lot of people do. But it's physiological. It's physiological. That's why in the mornings I do pranayama breath work to make sure that my breath is super strong all day. So when I'm on that screen getting mesmerized by something, I don't hold my breath as much. And my body is like, oh, thank you, and you're not strangling me. It's really simple. It's that simple. So the serpent is back, and it's coming out in our culture. Fake news and everything. It's like the serpent. What is the serpent? So in nature, the serpent was a co-evolving, co-evolutionary partner. Because without that tree snake, we wouldn't be sitting here having a screen with pixels on it and talking about all of it. We needed that snake. But now snakes aren't a threat to us anymore. They are in Australia, certainly up in Brizzy, right? They're still unbelievable up there. But they're not really an existential threat to us. However, this whole anxiety-inducing media is the serpent come back. And it can be based upon internal wounding and fear and psychopathy and sociopathy and all these sorts of things can generate this sort of thing, or it can come from another place, a healed place. We're making this serpent for good, for better or for worse, and it will continue to evolve us. But where does that come from? Where does all this fake news, and this actually looks like pretty mild fake news. Pope shocks world, endorses Donald Trump. Yoko Ono, I had an affair with Hillary Clinton. So I think this is pretty mild for 2016. I got to update this slide. But a lot of people are in this state now. They just think that the world's going to, hell in a handbasket, and they're walking around in this state that sometimes you'd see in Europe in the 10th century, where the end of the world was predicted, or there would be a rumor come in, and everyone would be in complete fear. And so we have a propensity to do that. But in the culture, alternatives are coming. And this is one of the more famous ones. Do you remember Return of the Jedi? Because you've all seen the new film, probably. So this is the scene in which Luke defeats Darth. But Luke now knows Darth is his father. And Darth basically says to Luke, Luke, take off this mask. And what does he see when he takes off the mask? This soft, wounded, beautiful individual. Look at those eyes. 1983, right? So this is bringing into our culture. This is from Joseph Campbell. It's from The Hero's Journey and all from George Lucas. But this is bringing into our culture that the outside is only a presentation of the wounds and the process on the inside. And if we have empathy for that little being that's running around, in Donald Trump's being is a wounded little boy that was brutally abused by his father. And we can have compassion for that. So no being is bad. No human is bad intrinsically. It's only that they're running processes and programs and they're suffering. This is what the Buddhists call suffering. These cycling systems of going and going and going. We now can read those systems. I'm in a program where we can scan a system. It's a way you go very, very spatial. And their system comes into your system. And you have a union. And so the little children come into your system because you're so open. And it's the technique to do the Luke, take off this mask and reveal. And these practices are now coming in. They're mixing in with the elixirs. They're mixing all together. The most powerful tools that we now have to work with those little inner parts. One of them is the snake itself, the serpent. So this is Mikey Siegel's project at Esalen last year, where they did the heart sync, where the heart rate, you feel the heart rate of the other, with music, and breath is matched as well. And this group will slowly and surely come into a single union, and the heartbeats are all at the same time, the breaths at the same time, and they enter into a new space. They go back to the tribal connection. And Mikey brought this out to the playa, and they had it moving, the heart sync, the heart thing was at the playa. This is from a movement called Trans-Tech, Transformative Technology. It's a big conference every October in the Bay Area. So this is using tech for healing and union. So it's not all the kind of upsetting things. It's the greatest tool we've ever made. So really it is about healing the inner kindergarten. When we come into that healed space and we're no longer triggered and we're no longer shouting at people and we're no longer, I suck, and all this stuff is healed finally, then all the parts of us that used to manage those wounds, that used to protect from, don't want to ever go close to that, or I suck, all that management structure, which is sometimes called a protector in internal family systems technology, is freed. It's like, I don't suck anymore. What do I do now? And the protector is a superpower, and it flips. It flips like this, and suddenly it's the best it's ever been because it was trained all your life to protect against that thing, and now it doesn't have to do that. It goes out into the world in its most brilliant, pure form. And that's what we're seeing in the healing arts over and over and over again. People are rolling out of that system, and they're rolling into the most beautiful expression. They're changing in a year, 6 months. Absolutely changing. Their families are shocked. You know how Ram Dass always said, think you're enlightened, go spend a weekend with your family. But, maybe it's finally setting. So that's the nuts and boltsy part of the talk. And I think that we're in good time to have our break and come back for the... yeah, we can take a couple of questions.
Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Bruce?
I just want to quickly put, you spoke earlier about the development of visual acuity, and I imagine you may later tie that into McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis. You were speaking earlier about the development of visual acuity. How do you feel that intersects with Terence's stoned ape hypothesis?
Yeah, no,
or is that something you go into later?
That's a good one for this group. So stoned ape, do you know about the stoned ape? You've seen some really great animations of this. That ape that comes along, sees a cow patty or a gazelle patty, and there's mushrooms like, oh, try that, boom, 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 and then it goes like, woo. Have you seen that animation? Somebody did that. So Terence's idea was that our mental acuity and our ability to see color and process and everything happened over a couple million years when we found psilocybin-rich mushrooms in the savanna, which then disappeared because of the drying of the savanna. Similar to the loss of the host or the magic mushroom, perhaps, for the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece for 1700 years. And so, yeah, I mean, it could be a factor. It really could be a factor. My propensity on this, and if Terence was still alive, we would be having these conversations, is that when you go into the rainforest, into the place in which we spent most of our evolution, and you come up to a state of awareness, however you do it, I found that the human beings are like kind of dull robots when they get off that canoe. Then they go in and they've done their dietas and everything, and then they start to clear out. They start to disconnect from phones and things, and then they start to get pure and pure, and then they take an elixir or they do a practice or whatever, and suddenly, late one night, you realize, oh my God, and you merge with the sonic environment of the jungle. And it's 1 trillion insects, it's billions of freaking amphibians, birds calling, New World monkeys screaming, but they're all in synchrony. They're all in a perfect symphony that never is the same twice. And then you realize that, oh my God, my awareness is turning back onto the baseline of the jungle, where we fell out when we left Eden. And it's really that environment alone, that information-rich, super high-tech environment, that probably drove us to consciousness as much as anything, because it was a force that had to go for about 70 to 75 million years. And, I don't think they were finding coprophytic, psilocybin mushrooms in that period. And that's when our brains are growing like crazy. So I think it's just the rainforest. Just the rainforest. And maybe the plants, Artie was trying all kinds of things.
Any other questions?
So, David Icke and the reptilian Satanist pedophiles. Is that a twisting of the fear that is primordial to our species with regards to the snakes in the tree, or is that just what the reptilians want us to think?
Yeah, no, there you have it. I was just, and watch for this, I was just on a program with George Norrie. Do you know who George Norrie is? So he runs a thing called Coast to Coast, and Terence is on it many times. And so George invited me to be on his TV show on Gaia TV called Beyond Belief. And he's featured this guy, David Icke, or whatever his name is, I'm not sure. And I kind of glanced at that stuff, but it's all like making stuff up to extract personal value or whatever. It's just making shit up, right? And the story. So it's in the game of Darwinian natural selection, if you can make up a powerful story and get a whole bunch of supporters in your Patreon or whatever, which is I'm trying to do, but I'm terrible at it. My cards are at the door. And you win the Darwinian game, right? So the Catholic Church had won that for almost 1,000 years. They won that game because they had the story. So in a way, you can divorce yourself from any judgment about that and watch the craft. Watch that craft. What is he tying into, right? To do that, to get millions of followers. Admire the skills and then do better. Do better. The more powerful story. Yeah. Time for one more. I know that people are going to get a lot.
Oh, sweet. Whoa, super feedback. Okay. I'm really curious about the evolution of the ideology behind the snake, because the physical presence and the confrontation with of danger, like in our monkey state, was really, really evident. What to you is the motivation for us to willingly create that danger within, or create that like the archetype essentially within our modern age?
I think it's our evolutionary fate. Is this? Oh, it's still on. Yep. It's our evolutionary fate. We were so attracted to those scales, right? So even, I would guarantee you that the colony of prosimians would watch those snakes and study them because they were really cool, right? They didn't have media, YouTube, or anything. That was their YouTube, right? It's like, ooh, that's a cool one. Look at that color. So it's the admiration of that, because we love it. We absolutely love it. We love like patterns and, shiny things, and we just love it. I mean, we love that stuff. So, and it made us. So, but by understanding our inner nature, what do we make? What kind of snake do we make? What kind of pattern do we say to the snake? Here, you pattern this one. So Adolf Hitler and the Nazis stepped into a vacuum in the 1930s where they realized, wow, there's a huge amount of disaffection in the society. We can create all this imagery, make up shit that never happened for the Teutonic greatness and all those banners and everything at Nuremberg and whatnot. Make all that shit up, because it will literally rile up the population, German population, which are pretty dialed in people, right? But we can mobilize them, and we can create drugs to do it, like Paravital, right? What was it? Paravitin, yeah. So they shipped the chemical industries, which were the leading in the world, made a huge amount of methamphetamine and prescribed it to all the housewives of Germany and to the troops on the Eastern Front. So the whole place was powered on meth. And so it became this, but for people it was like, wow, we are one, we are a union, we've been done wrong. We are creating the future, we are creating the great modernist future. Of course, in Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, he parodies all this. The Great Dictator was published before World War II, or was in theaters. But this is no kidding. I mean, they just like nailed it. They just nailed it because they knew how to use the power of media. They have the first television, for God's sakes. They were, my God, I mean, the Third Reich kind of had nailed it, but it impaled itself on trauma. So what was going on? Adolf Hitler had Parkinson's. So he went to this rigid, and at the very last moments of Berlin, he's in the bunker. He will not give up. He will not give up, and they self-immolated. A friend of mine who's now dead was there. He was part of the first Soviet forces to enter Berlin. They got to where the bunker was, and they saw the burned bodies of Eva Braun and Hitler. He's the only person that has borne witness to that. That's what it went all the way to, and the ruined city around them. It's no fooling, guys, this stuff, what's going on in here that drives society. But the good news is, back in the 30s or 40s or up to the 80s and 90s, people would say, oh, they're just that way, right? People are just that way. And we just accept that on face value. Now we can actually scan and do the OS tracking. Like, we know exactly how their system's working, and we can predict exactly what they're going to do in any circumstance. We're getting that fine-tuned. In the old days, in the shamanic cultures, especially women, they had this tracking ability, this what's called attunement. These wise women, they knew precisely what was inside that young boy's heart and soul and where that came from and that patterning and that wounding. And they would work for their initiation. They would work for their healing, and they would work for the proper pairing with a partner so that the tribe stayed healthy. That attunement was brilliant. It was called witch work, and it was destroyed in the 14th and 15th century. That type of genius, and it's returning. It's a kind of Jedi power, I kid you not. When we're in our healing group, we have 100 people in the room, 60 new students, and it is like a Jedi force. I mean, Annalisa will do this in somebody's field, and she'll touch something inside their field, just non-locally, standing in front of them, and they'll just start rolling. Because she can see and talk to the part that may be a schizoid wound from birth. And it starts to roll, and the body's undulating, and you just watch this stuff. For us, it's normal, right? But if you walked into this room, you have no idea what's going on. And it's repeatable, non-local tracking of individual system to system, seeing lineage data come down, seeing ancestral wounds, like boom, 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 like data's downloading from a person you're working with, and you're reflecting, and they're going, yeah, that's what happened. Now let's work on clearing that, you know? So these technologies, if they can be accelerated, we can heal humanity like rippling from the bottom up, and we can raise beautiful children that don't carry these wounds. Then they're not susceptible to the fake news and the bad serpent we're all afraid of. They're no longer susceptible to that because there's no channel in. You know, they just have compassion for the person, the David, whatever his name, have compassion for his unmet need, right? He probably has a deep unmet need wound to constantly do this. You know, and what if somebody sat with him? Recently, I've encountered Deepak Chopra many times at conferences. We're often the same keynote, like we're back-to-back keynotes, and we've started a kind of love affair. And here's a guy that is super triggered around science, you know, had these debates with people at Caltech and has really made an embarrassment of himself. When I looked into Deepak's eyes at this conference called Science and Non-Duality 2-3 years ago, I had an immediate download because he's got these big diamond-studded glasses, right? And somebody had brought me over to meet him because he wanted to meet me for some reason. I looked into Deepak's eyes, and the terrified little boy was looking out. And I went, oh. And I connected with that boy, and that boy showed me what happened in sub-second, like super fast, like chased in the street of India. There were other boys shouting him down around him. He couldn't get out. It was horrible. And then there was a young man that his father was berating him, saying, you're not a real doctor, you're not a real scientist, I'm disappointed in you. And then bing, 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 bing. Like, that's why Deepak's triggered. Whoa. And then we met a year later at the Science of Consciousness at Tucson, and we did a Facebook Live thing together, and he said, I'm suffering. I've got a deep fatigue and internal misery, and I gotta heal myself. I gotta do this work now. And he's old generation, he's old school, right? And so we're getting closer and closer so that his system trusts mine so that I can help to roll Deepak. Bring resources to help this man. He's suffering, you know? And so if Deepak can roll, and he can roll out of those wounds, and he's selling his companies, he said, I just can't deal with this anymore. I'm 72 years old, and if he rolls, and he comes back into the world, and he's standing in front of his 20,000 people that he does, and they'll feel something different, like, hey dude, what happened? Woo, do you feel different? No longer guarded. He'd just be this radiant being. So we can do this for people like that have a huge magnifier factor. Then people say, how did this happen for you? And then his whole movement will convert, not just from Ayurveda and all those sorts of things, it'll convert into this work. Because they'll see that Deepak took the chance to free himself from this misery of this early conditioning. So I don't know how I got off on that one, but so we come back. Oh, so the next section, we're going to really go ethereal. So we're going to go from the mundane to the pure magic. And it'll be a little lighter weight and a little shorter as well. And then we'll open the floor for discussion, because that's where the payoff is. So, how's everyone doing? Your brains are still lucid and rattling around in your crania? So, what we're going to look at now is going to the more ethereal. And I had a lot of conversations during the break about people who have endo download experiences, and they have a connection with this thing that's more powerful, this intelligence, or that they notice in their lives that there's all these synchronous events happening more fast and fast. And I think that what is coming is a new thing is emerging, that it lives from our lives, it lives through our minds, through our bodies, through all of nature. A new thing is rising, and it will be the great tool that we can surf into a survivable and thriving future if we just tap into this thing. So I call this surfing probability. And we're going to geek out just a little bit because all of this started in the magical moment where you had the universe undergo something called cosmogenesis, and we think it's sort of a Big Bang thing. And particles are formed, and then they form into galaxies and star fields, and suns start, and planets start. A shit ton of dust is made. It's mostly the main product of the cosmos is dust. But then it isn't very productive, so the universe goes on for 10, 12, 13 billion years, just makes a bunch of heavier elements, but stars are the same as when you look back 10 billion years. The universe gets a D for creativity, actually, because nothing's going on, right? And now it's just trying to say, bugger it, I'm tired of all these particles, I want to dissolve, so it's expanding faster. But then in the middle of all that comes something unique, biology or life, which is different than physics, even though it uses physics to do its thing. So physics could be thought of as an undulating plane, where you push down here and it undulates predictably over there. And this came from a download dream one night. I was saying, what is going on? Terence used to always ask the question, what is going on? You know, and we used to sit half the night trying to work out, like he had this ideas of concrescence into novelty, and that was all from Whitehead, right? And so he used to talk about all that and novelty and how do things get more and why are they accelerating? And so actually I took that on in my PhD work and did a gigantic supercomputer simulation that ran for half a year to find the formula of complexity into novelty. That was in 2007 to 10. Found that formula, it's called stochastic hill climbing. It works rockingly well, and it's a single formula that goes from cosmogenesis through biogenesis and all the way to conscious genesis. It's the math behind it. And this was an emergent property of that. So one night I had another dream, and the ineffable in that dream was cranky. Sometimes they're cranky. And I said, what's going on? And it said, you know, are you sitting down? And I said, I'm lying down. I'm on a lawn chair. And I said, okay, you listen and you listen good, as I grabbed my shirt collar. And it showed me, it said, I will show you how you were made. And so I was in this little undulating plane, and it said, push down here. I pushed down and it undulated predictably. It's a classical physics. And then it showed these compartments opening up in the plane. It said, oh, those are my favorite things. Those are protocells. And it said, look closely. And I looked closely, and there were little things crowded in them, bouncing around. And it asked me, what do you see? I said, I don't know, some kind of crowding mechanism. And then it put two of them next to each other, and I noticed that there was stuff going between them through the membrane in this traffic. And it said, what do you see? I said, I don't know, like some kind of traffic or something. And then it did a whole mass of them, and it showed all this interaction between the sludge, and it said, what do you see? I said, I don't know, some kind of a network or something? And then it pulled these Cartesian plots into my consciousness. So this is a super reductionist ineffable, like Descartes' ineffable. So it showed these curves going up, you know, exponentially, P being probability. It said probability is shaped by these compartments. If you put stuff in them, they're more likely to interact. If they're all distributed everywhere, they're not going to interact. So these compartments are probability machines. And then this I thing was interconnection, that if compartments are near each other, something over here can cause a change in one over here, which is causing a change here, and that's a network. Physics doesn't do networks. So this is something in between physics and what's to come next. And then it asked me, what comes next? I said, I don't know, some kind of a memory or something? And it showed this, genetic polymer. He said, once you have this system that shapes probability and network, you can have memory arise. And then the scene changed, it went away, and it showed me this. It said, this is the system, the TOE, the theory of everything. Everyone has their own favorite TOE, but this is the one that came that night. Probability shaping through crowding. The connection of these crowding spaces creates a network that spontaneously arises, and memory can be read and written in that system. Boom, 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 boom. And what it showed was, this is the engine. This is the engine that pulled biology out of physics through the protocellular world. It spun for billions of years, trillions of times, and it powered up the living world. But then it kept going, and it powered up intelligence, multicellularity, it powered up culture and technology, and it's still powering everything at all levels. And so what we're doing in this room is we're crowded together in a compartment. We then symbolically message each other in a network, and we're remembering stuff for next time. That's called cultural evolution. So this is a PIM system. Your smartphone is a PIM device. It crowds stuff together in apps and data. It networks with other smartphones, and it reads and writes a ton of memory, and the network evolves. Everything, so the ineffable grabbed my shirt collar and said, there's nothing outside this system. So in some ways, it's like a new Copernican center. Copernicus proposed that the Earth was not the center of the universe or the solar system, but the sun was, published it wisely after his death so he didn't lose his head or his funding. You know, Galileo took the heat for this. So this PIM thing, which we call in our field the progenote, could be at the center of everything. It could be a new Copernican center. It can explain the origin of life itself, how evolutionary biology goes. Ken Wilber got into this when I went to see him a couple of years ago. It can go into metaphysics. Deepak Chopra was into this. We've been starting to meet with Google because AI is this very restricted, brittle bunch of linear algebra. Machine learning is like freaking going nowhere. I mean, it's like so slow. When they saw the presentation of this thing, they said, we can put PIM into the core of Google's future AI and machine learning because we can then adopt evolution and genes into software. So software works like a living system. So that's going into there. Maybe it's the basis of economy, et cetera, and it certainly it will be a huge thing in physics because it's how life probably works. So the universe is an on-off system, the cycles. There's a really two-cycle engine. When you add life, you get memory. So it has a third thing it goes through, like, I got genes, I can build the cell the next time, or build a better car, you know. When you add neurons, you add learning in the lifetime of an organism, like a fourth cycle. When you add enough neurons together, you get consciousness, self-awareness, planning, designs, blueprints, music. And the prediction we have is that this PIM is cycling at all levels like a big durja in Tibetan Buddhism, and it generates all observable phenomena and all felt experience, at all levels. So, our consciousness samples this field. So this is what is generating this etheric field of coincidence and of human connection, of energy, and stuff that happens in the psychedelic experience. Perhaps is being powered by this. So here it is. You start with physics, you cycle 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and where are you going? Perhaps what this is, you get to the top of this stack, and it's awareness aware of itself. This is called Dharmakaya in the old Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Awareness aware of itself, which rolls into instantaneous intelligent healing. So if you're aware of where you came from, how you work, how miraculous you are, how stupendously amazing all beings are, you come into this. Awareness looking back on its own origins and evolution, and that provides this. The total unity into the gratitude of just being. And in our era of science, we can come into this knowing now. We have the tools, we have the science, we have telescopes to look back in time. We're coming into awareness how we were made. We can come into this state faster and faster. More and more of us can reach this and pop into this, and then we pop out into ordinary kind of things, and then we pop back in and we pop out. Now, how do you use this tool? So what is going on, I think, is this. So when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, I really wanted to do cartooning, and I really wanted to work on origin life and all this stuff. So what I learned to do as a little kid was to cast into the future. So I didn't know you couldn't do this. So I would go out for these walks and say, future selves, listen, this is what we want to do. And I would see my future selves as silhouettes going all the way down through time. And I would say, oh, they're listening. And then I would pick up a little marble or a request and send it to all the future selves. And I would figure it's done. And I've sent the request. Now I just have to wait attentively for this stuff to come back. And so it's like I was casting into the future some beautiful goal, and these little marbles that would then roll down valleys of probability. I would pick them up, like, go to this uni, do this thing. You know, boom, 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 30, 40 years of that. And I find myself in Australia standing at the outcrop, touching the very solution to life's origins in just 40 years. So the field answered my request, and it bounced me around the world, and I picked up the marbles and collected them until it placed me in the most improbable circumstance of the discovery of the oldest ancestor. You know, because I was faithful, I was listening, and I wasn't nervous or worried about it, I was patient. So I think that this is a tool we can use to get from the present to remarkable outcomes. And you can set this in your own life. Set an intention that's pay attention and then take actions. And how is this all driven? It's driven by this. The sun is turning to face, the earth is turning into face the solar radiation every morning, and the earth is being bathed by it. And that's the master cycler. That's turning and turning and turning and running all cells, all weather processes. It's driving geology, it's driving organisms, it's driving us, and we eat our breakfast and come down to work. This is the master cycler, and it's spinning, 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 and it's running this PIM thing at all levels in a massive scale. So what does this generate? I call this God for geeks, since you are all certified geeks. So one day I was at Moss Beach in Northern California. Maybe Mark's been there. It's a beautiful beach with the sunsets are amazing. And I opened my system and I projected into the cosmos because I could see the stars emerging, and I said, do you know how rare we are? Do you know that we are standing on a 4 billion year tall improbability gradient, that we shouldn't exist? An asteroid impact should have stopped this. Like Mars, our oceans should have evaporated. You know, all these things, we are a rare, incredibly rare creation, and we got all the way to self-awareness, and we got all the way to asking the question of where we came from and how we boot up, and like, is there anyone out there? Or, dear large cosmos, pay attention to us. Please pay attention to us, because we're also at risk. We're at high existential risk. And this is what came into my field of view. It's probably the most powerful thing that's ever come to me. This silver spire, this kind of living liquid icicle grew. And at its base was the origin, position of origin. This is geology being made by the explosion of the cosmos and the heavier elements. And this is the microbial world that is starting, being stacked by this, the sun rising. It's pushing organisms to complexity higher and higher and higher and higher, and trillions of cycles. And it's running this PIM thingamajig. And the PIM thingamajig is generating tons of memories in terms of genes in the beginning, but then it sprays out cultural memories and mind memories, and it's going faster and faster and faster, and it explodes into this huge kind of Akashic field of stuff it's in the field, it's in the awareness, it's all interconnected. And then it showed me this. It showed me this little thing, like, what is that? Well, it's an eye opening. It's self-awareness. Cetaceans, probably parrots, probably us. Like, we're beings. Oh my God, we're beings and you're a being and I'm a being. And like the awakening to the fact of beingness happened at some point several million years ago across several species. And then we end up just within shooting distance, within reach of this. So let's climb up all the way toward this. So what this is us. We're now in this incredible stressor because we have generated the most dense field that's ever existed on the planet with our smartphones and our minds and our huge big brains and our interactions and our pheromones and our air travel and our concerns and worries and our culture and our YouTube videos is this huge, dense thing. And it's getting more and more and more coherent. And the field, we feel it. Wow. Look at what just happened. Look at that probability thing. Because what the field does, you see this little P here? It shapes probability. That's what it knows how to do. That's what life does. Life opens pathways to improbable events. So when you put life this densely interconnected, it gets rockingly good at this job. And I'll tell you a story of a demo. So these days, and this could be good for you, I decided, look, I've known about this field and felt it all my life, but I want to have direct contact with it. I figure I'm ready. You know, I'm dialed in, I've done my own healing, I won't attach. I'll be measured about it. I'll be a little skeptical of what comes. And I wanted to say hi. Hi. So I went on a walk up in the redwood forest and the oak forest near where I live. And I left my phone in the car. This is important. Like, leave your phone in the car. And then I got halfway up the mountain. I was like, I went like this. I dropped the veil. So there was full exposure. And I said, I see you. I know what you're doing. I'm deeply appreciative. And I will continue to be your faithful follower. I will follow all the marbles you send me. I am on the path. I am dedicated. Just total appreciation of thank you. And this time around, and I can feel it again, this square opens up in my field of vision. This shaky. Sometimes you see this sometimes in the medicines as well. Like, it's the eye that's looking right at you, right? Directly, eye to eye. You know, hello, kind of thing. Boom. I was like, yes. And that was that simple thing. And then, boom, it went. And then from that point on, I was completely dialed in. Just every bird song, everything's now in synchrony. Everything is choreographed, like boom, 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 boom. And I'm going up to the mountaintop, and there's the bench I usually sit on. I'm now being driven by field itself, like I used to do when I was a kid, when I'd leave home, being a sock puppet of the field. Like, where is it gonna take me today? You know, like boom. So I'm going over to the bench, and I sit on the right side of the bench. I just do it because my body is physically moved there, because I'm so dialed in. And then 5 minutes later, I hear voices behind me, and it's three older people, and they're bustling up, and they go, "Can we sit here?" Like, sure, you know, because they see that I'm not in the middle of the bench, which might have turned them off. And yeah, you know, "Can we have lunch?" I say, "Sure, you can have lunch." And then we start to talk. And it's an older man and his wife and her best friend. And they always hike up on Skyline. And I start talking about, well, I'm working on the origin of life and in science, because I figured they seem pretty smart. And they would be interested. And I said that, blah, 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 blah. And I said, you know, just last week, I was in Texas, and I realized somebody asked me about Nobel Prizes for this work. And I said, no, I'm too crazy to get a Nobel Prize. I don't have 500 peer-reviewed papers. It's not for me. But then I decided to say to the room of postdocs, I said, there's at least a half a dozen Nobel Prizes in this work to get their attention. And they were like, yeah. You know, because they're ambitious. They're 28 years old, they're from Harvard and MIT and Caltech, and boom, so I get their attention so that, and I said, and I want to be the gray-haired old guy, crazy guy in the back of the room in Stockholm when you're going up to get your Nobel Prize and doing your Nobel lecture. And the man looked up at me and he said, that's what I'm doing next week. I said, oh, really? Yeah, I'm the crazy old guy. I'm sitting in the back of the room and my graduate student's getting the Nobel Prize in economics. And this is the second time I've done this. And his wife was at, and his wife said, I want to wear the hippie outfit, but I know I'll end up wearing black. You know, and they became best friends. And I was walking down the mountain and I said to the field, you rock. The probability of that happening is so small, is infinitesimally small, that this would happen, bang, bang, like that. And I just trust it. Because in last summer, and this is where we'll go into the climate change, there we are back here, is this thing. You can communicate with it. It can do a good job for you. So the big server call is this, right? Still going on all over the country. Violent, you know, horrific. We have some of it in California, but not on the scale. The tens of millions of hectares here. So this is a wake-up call for our species. But we've been here before. So when the plains of Africa, in East Africa, they split off from the Rift Valley and dried out, we learned climate shock. Our species was thrown out of Eden into the savanna. Then East Africa completely dried out and our kind were shoved into a corner of South Africa, where mitochondrial Eve probably was born. Then we marched out of Africa into the glaciers of Europe. And then our kind came to the Port Hedland area and adapted exquisitely to the entire continent of Australia, from the high central desert to Queensland to the pine forest down near Adelaide, things like that. Exquisite adaptation. We are creatures of climate change. We are creatures of climate shock. The climate change and these shocks made us as much as the serpent did. We're pre-adapted for this thing. We really are. So what happened last summer was, about a year ago, I was in the country of Qatar in the Middle East, and I met because the previous year I had gone to the top of that mountain again, and I'd opened to the field, and for an hour I was projecting into the field. I said, dude, we need your help. We need you to be more coherent. We need more guidance, more probabilistic shaping, everything. Don't get distracted. It's like Mama Aya, she gets super distracted a lot of the time, like, well, now we're going over here, now we're going over here. And if you can focus her down, like, no, be present, be in front of me. We need you to be in the room. There's healing to be done, because these fields just get freaking, there's no like bookkeeping system going on in there. It's our conscious attention that allows them to exist. So if our conscious attention is really super clear, they show up. That's one of the things I've learned. So a year and a half ago, I said to the field, we need help. Please, like, we need like stuff to happen. And within 6 months, it had lined everything up. I found myself in Qatar and Doha, in front of members of the royal family, doing talks, and in our group was Admiral Norman Hayes from the US Navy. And I've been doing work with the Pentagon for about 20 years. In fact, our report of 2003 was the source report for Andrew Marshall and Peter Schwartz that ended up turning on the Pentagon to climate change. And there's a documentary out about this now. Like, wow, that resulted in this. That was a trim tab thing that caused the Pentagon to be activated. And Norman Hayes was there. I was like, wow, you are into forward planning, I'm into forward planning. He's this short black admiral, and I'm this tall, lanky hippie from California, and you'd think we'd never get along, and we just fell in love, basically. And he and I cooked up this Climate Mitigation Associates. He came up with strategy to use flag officers, retired flag officers from the Pentagon who advised giant financial funds to switch the priorities of those funds into climate mitigation investment. $10 trillion is what we need to move in the next 10 years, probably more. And he said, this will work. 4 stars will move this, they will shift this. So we started working on it, and we launched a group called Climate Mitigation Associates. And now it's just like literally days ago, they launched the prize, Bridge Between Crisis and Innovation, Global Design Challenge, 10 moonshots, we call them, like the Apollo moonshot. In 10 years, $10 million prize. We need to raise all that money. It's like over $1 billion. Well, over 100 million, it's 300 million. But what we're putting into the group is everything good, everything that is good about what humans are good at doing. We're ignoring the politics. Where the money goes is what will happen. You can ignore your politics, you can ignore your ideologies. Google and Facebook are in a panic because they built $10 billion in campus at sea level on the bay, and they're in a freaking panic. And the county of San Mateo has no answers. So Google said, we'll write the check, we'll do the studies. We need a seawall, but we need a living seawall, or we need something better. We can't build concrete. Her Royal Highness in Qatar is like, we have to seawall this country because it rained an inch 3 weeks ago and flooded Qatar, and they didn't ever build drainage. And so seawater went, and stormwater went into the subway system that's connecting the stadiums for the World Cup. It was horrific. It was like, we screwed up. So Qatar's like, we screwed up. We need to book $300 billion into changing everything. We have to build a living seawall around the country that'll allow us to raise cows so we don't import hay with cows in sheds for cream. It's ridiculous, right? So the early movers, the high net worth, Chevron, the city of Houston is ready to move. Investment, protect our infrastructure. Airports all over the world, 70% of the world's airports are under threat, sea level rise. The coronavirus, huge existential threat. The Spanish flu killed 1 in 5 humans 100 years ago, and it traveled by steamship. We need universal antivirals. We need an antibiotic for virals, or for viruses. So all these things, but we can do them all. So it's a kind of positive, constructivist approach to this. So what we're doing in our little group, and we're just starting, is bringing Silicon Valley venture capital. We have several members that are part of big VC firms, high net worth individuals, innovation funds, clients, which will be Google and Facebook and Chevron, and big funds like Carlyle Group, the US Pentagon. You know, these are very solid partners to say, no, it's time to get to work. Sorry about all the discussion, and yes, we're woken up, but we have to get to work, and we have to do systemic things on a massive scale globally. Admiral Hayes basically said, we can't do local things. It has to be a humanity-based effort. And we have the capital. It's all in the stupid hedge funds doing nothing. There's no returns on that. You know, our wonderful psychopathic friends who run finance, they can be moved. They can be moved by various motivations about risk and stuff like that. Can be done. That money will start to flow, and we can start building solutions. Because it's probably too late to do anything about the gas that's already on the way. And if we're releasing methane, we've got a big problem that's at least a 500-year problem, and that's starting to happen. So we can bridge this thing. So if we do all that, and just tack this on to the end, how much time we have, one of the other things that I've worked on is what happens to life. So we get to complex life. We find out how we were made. We heal our inner wounds. We build the infrastructure to build a sustainable civilization. We preserve some of the biodiversity so we can repopulate it when we take the pressure off, when we have better agricultural practice, all the things we know we can do. Then what do we get to do for life? Well, James Lovelock, in his book, Rough Ride to the Future, predicts that we have 100 million years left for complex life on land, because the sun's heat curve is like this. We get to 1.5 watts per square meter of incident radiation. We flip to Venus. We convert into Venus conditions. So it's called the Venus Terminator. We go out of habitability. Like those worlds, I showed you the TRAPPIST, what's in the Goldilocks, we go out of the Goldilocks zone as an entire planet. Even after we're gone, this is guaranteed to happen. And then, so there is no more complex life. There's no more plants on land. We go down to the microbiome, to the end of the Earth, and the oceans will evaporate. It would look like Venus. So if Gaia is a thing, if Gaia is a real entity, we are her greatest creation. I was told this one night with Dennis McKenna at a lucuma tree in the Sacred Valley that You are our greatest creation. Even though you've cut down all my kind and I am the last to stand in the sacred valley, you still are my beloved creation of the biosphere. And this should go on. This experiment must go on. Build me a new home. Make me new worlds. So I came up with this technique. I've been doing work with NASA for 10 years, or 20 years, and this is what they thought space travel would look like back in the 1950s. And what we came up with was this. If we're going to extend life into the cosmos, we have to make new worlds. And what we do is we take helium balloon enclosures and we enclose an asteroid. This is after 25, 30 years of work on this gosh darn thing. Close it down. It came to us in a flash in 2014. Here's the asteroid, it's tumbling. We put a controlling gas. The asteroid comes into friction with the gas and stops tumbling. And then we can use waves of gas from the same ductwork. You're back in nerddom here, but to push the asteroid, and then we fire out back and we keep the entire thing coupled, and now we can relocate them. And why are we relocating them? Because we're made out of them. They're an existential threat to us, but they contain all the organics and water ice and everything we need to build a solar system civilization. So here's one of the targets, a comet head. This is what the Europeans visited. These are wet neos blowing water off. There's a nickel iron asteroid, good nickel and iron. We can make fuel by evaporating the ice into vapor, and then we can fill tanks, and we can build fueling stations all over the solar system for Elon Musk or whoever needs them. We can take minerals out of asteroids and plate parts and make the parts of the O'Neill space colonies. And this is my favorite, we can make these into biospheres that we can inoculate with life and harvest. It's a single solution that looks a lot like life's origins. Again, it's an encapsulation. So we can build the space stations that you see in like the Expanse and in 2001, because we can build everything in space and feed people in space. We can go to Mars with filled fuel tanks, and when the Mars ship gets there, it pops off of the empty and gets a full one, and we can then explore Mars sustainably. And we can open the entire solar system to potentially billions of people moving, taking the pressure off the Earth in the 2000s, 2000 to 3000, and then learning exquisitely how to manage biospheres in a healthy way. Because we have the whole overview. We've learned how to do this. So I want to thank you for getting this far with me, and I think we have some time for continued questions and dialogue. We have a Patreon. Everyone's got a Patreon, right? But friends of mine have set this up so that we can have monthly and bi-monthly discussions and continue this work, and also develop projects. So you can be involved in this project or Origins of Life or the healing work that we're doing. So if you want to have an engagement, I get so much email now that I just can't answer it. So people who join the container of the Patreon, even at a minimal level, that gives me a way to work with groups. And so please, if you want to do that, provides me travel support. So actually, if we get the Patreon up a little more, I'll be able to come back for Rainbow in April. And we can do more things here in Sydney as well. So that's what it's for. So thank you.
Bruce, it's wonderful to be in the presence of your mind. Yeah, so thank you. There's so much that one could dig into. I just wanted to pick up on one little thing, which is that the PMI New Copernican Center model, which seemed to me raise the issue. One possible issue would be the so-called hard problem of consciousness, where the basic concern is that a third-person description of an external system has an explanatory gap. Where is awareness or internality within that system. So I imagine memory, in some sense, is the part of the PMI model that does it. But still, you're giving an external description of memory there. So how do you get internality from the system?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but perhaps...
Do you know the so-called hard problem of consciousness?
Oh, yeah.
David Chalmers and so on?
Yeah.
So I'm basically wondering if you can reflect on that issue within the context of the model.
I think that we don't know enough yet to even ask those questions. The message that came from me, I was speaking for Stuart Hammeroff at the Science of Conscious for a couple of years, and I kept coming back to, there was this vision of us being at the foot of the Himalayas, and we're studying a molehill, and yet there's this mountain range up there, and that our whole focus on hard problems and whatnot is very mental. It's very non-experiential. And when I was at TSC, this conference, I noticed that people presenting that were coming from mental, and they had PowerPoints with bullets, They weren't coming from an embodied experience. And the answer that came to me was you can't mentate this thing into solution. You can't know it, but you can become it. So it's like the old Sufis, the whirling dervishes. I mean, what they do is they just become awareness and consciousness of the motion of their bodies and the music and the beat, and that we merge with it. And Mama Aya once told me, she said, Dummkopf, you can't know it, but you can become it. Get up, stop thinking, and start moving. And she showed me how to do that, how to merge, how to just become it, because your monkey brain is not large enough, and it's not nuanced enough to come into contact with with the big thing. But your entire body and your system and your lineage and your heart, your whole self can, not the mind on its own. You almost have to turn that off and to come into union. So that was just my own, when I get into conversations about panpsychism and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Just talking about the actual Big Bang angle of it. I've had downloads to do with this where if consciousness is primary, then we existed before the Big Bang. Yeah. So before we invented time, so we had plenty of time to plan all this prior to the happening. So if we designed it so that atoms were in a twin form, and there was a separation of outward and a contraction, where the contraction loses the main mass while retaining what's being called the gimmel in some of the discussions. In a concentrated mass, if the atoms are twins, then that gives that communication thing between the twin atoms and the outward atoms, explaining why all atoms can communicate with each other.
Yeah,
that's an idea.
Physics is not really my department. I'm not at a high enough pay grade for that. But what I can tell you is an experience that I had was, I'm a super dialed in skeptical reductionist in one level. So I'll always carry that in, especially when in contact with these big energies and ineffables. And there was an experience one night where I became the first dividing protocell, because I wanted to try to crack this problem, crack this challenge. And the only way to do it was the ineffables with me took me through my own conception and birth. She made me into the sperm and shot me toward the egg. And then I felt my mother's love for the first time, because I was given up at adoption. I was adopted at birth. I felt my mother's love in the belly just for a moment, and then they gave me up. The whispers happened in the field, and I felt the connection. So she allowed me to relive that, which allowed me to heal a huge part. But it made me into a capsule. because I knew I was alone. When the embryo, or the barely conscious being in the belly, has the connection that is dropped, its consciousness, such as it is, goes to look for it. And that's where I do something called realming. I go back through time, I go through space to look for love, actually. But then we were standing there, the Madre and I was like, that was beautiful, thank you. That was a healing. And she said, you're pretty cool. That's nice. Oh. And I said, well, I'm actually cooler than you know. I'm always telling the Madre about us, about humans, because she's like not really got a clue of who we are. It's just like we show up and then all this stuff happens. She gets all this work and then we go and then we show up again. I said, I'll take you on a trip around the planet. And so I took her on a trip around the earth in an endo trip to show her, like, this is sushi. It's made partly with you and partly with things from the sea, and we make like 1 trillion of them a day. And we travel in tubes this way and in boxes this way. And she's like, that's cool, because doesn't know anything about us. And then I said, and do you want to go back to where we were all born? Not just you, because you're only 370 million years old. You're a rainforest. Would you like to go back? And she was like, yeah. So we'd merge into one being, and it's this whole process of like non-dual shaking together. Because otherwise it's like, how you doing, how you doing, how you doing, how you doing? So you just become one. And usually what happens, I open my eyes, and she's in shock when she sees us. It's like, holy shit. I said, don't worry about it. And then I pulled the lever on the endo trips. And the first one was to go through all my sperm and my father's sperm and grandfather's sperm and just keep going faster and faster through all mammalian sperm, all the join points, and then burst into the fish world, and then burst into the worm world, and then burst into the microbial world. And that's the tough one, because that's 3 billion years of freaking dense ancestry. So I was like, hold on, we're pulling the lever, we're gonna go full power to get through this, and holding my brow so that the brain temps don't go too high, because you have to watch that when you're doing that type of work. Zooming back through till we broke through the brown clouds, landed in the cycling hot spring pool that you saw here. And then the second endo trip, boom, started up fast, because at this peak level, you can't sustain it long. And then, because you're pumping your own DMT at the same time, most of these types of trips are endo trips, because then you can really sustain them. It doesn't pull you off. And then suddenly, there it was, the neon-filled protocell that had all the right components to come to be alive. And then I'm at this point asking the big ineffable, what do I do? Like, hello, what do I do? And they said, the answer is always the same. Become it now. Like, boom, I am that protocell. Squishy, and there's lipids and polymers and all kinds of things. And then I start to go unconscious. I start to go out. And I asked the ineffable, what's going on? He said, dude, you asked to go through your birth. How can you be around for your birth? You're going to come into existence for the first time. Like, boom, I was out. And then I came to birth screaming. I don't know if it was 10 minutes or 2 minutes or a nanosecond, but the protocell that I was tearing itself apart in the first attempted division. Intense. It was the first attempt at birth, and it was ripping apart, and I was screaming inside. And I watched polymers moving, like crazy stuff, and this vacuole got pulled off, and it was dark inside, and it was dead. And I was alive. And that was the clue to this entire science right there. 3 months later, it came as an endo download, the entire system that you saw. But then what I did, and I often do after these really peak level things, you feel the tug on your waistcoat. You should always wear waistcoats when you're doing this type of work, because then you can pull time to go, because you can't sustain, right? And I always like sit up and like, one more question. And like the ineffable's like, all right, I just one more question. You're interminable questions, And I said, but there wasn't supposed to be life before. There wasn't supposed to be consciousness before this act, right? But I felt a mind. I felt intelligence moving those polymers somehow. I felt a mind there, a hand, if you will. And I said, how can it be? And I sat up on my haunches, because what you then do is you present. You get very empty and present for the answer. And the answer was, I opened my eyes, it was in the Amazon, and there was light all over the palm fronds and the forest of the full moon, and those resolved into star fields and galaxies and nebulae and everything, and it resolved into this huge thing that came rushing toward my consciousness and slammed into it and knocked me down, knocked me right off my haunches, the totality of the cosmos. And the voice came, this grew big enough to permit you to come into being. And it was the answer. The totality, the total of all that is, provided us that pathway, that miracle. And there's nothing left out. So that was my own experience of asking that question.
So I'm wondering, like, if you have any thoughts on how quantum theory and your PIM model coexist, or like, if you have any thoughts on that, like these two things coming together to explain the totality of everything.
Every time I go toward this place, I invite my neighbor Nick Herbert over, and Nick Herbert is an expert in quantum mechanics. I mean, he worked with John Bell. He's in a book called, you should read it, it's called How the Hippies Saved Physics. And what Nick does, every time I bring up these notions, he slaps my wrists and says, you haven't a clue what you're knowing. You're talking classically, but this world of the quantum is so weird, is so beyond your cognition, because Nick has spent 70 years pondering it. And helped prove non-locality. So he lives in that world. He has something called quantum tantra, where he's literally trying to have a personal and visceral connection with that realm all the way, asking the question, why does the quantum world bother to manifest us and how? So he always says, you're misusing terms. I mean, it's like what happens with poor Deepak and all the people who are using the word quantum, you know. It doesn't really apply most of the way. Now you are discovering that in biology, you know, photosynthesis uses tunneling, and perhaps, you know, this is Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, that the microtubules in the brain are doing quantum-y things, but I don't understand it.
Okay, thank you.
Can I be selfish and ask one question quickly? I was just wondering, thinking about sort of stoned ape theory and Terence McKenna, I have a lot of problems with that theory, but one of them was something you alluded to earlier in your talk, which was that according to his theory, the use of mushrooms accelerated the progression and evolution of human language, of human development, maybe of the neocortex developing, things like this. And you were alluding to, well, maybe the complexity of the environment was enough for that to occur. And our response, our need to adapt to that complex environment was enough. I tend to agree, but I'm wondering, how would you, looking like at your diagram and the way you explained your diagram, there's this tendency for people to look for explanations for this ever-evolving, speedier evolution of consciousness and complexity of evolution happening at faster and faster rates. Maybe you look at the way culture has evolved over the past few hundred years, and you look at the way human intelligence has evolved over the past thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And people, I guess, Terence McKenna might have been looking for an explanation for how this became so quick and why is this accelerating. I'm wondering, do you have an explanation according to maybe your ways of looking at the evolution over time of why it seems like evolution is speeding up and accelerating?
I think the only thing we can know is what's happening, say, we feel in our bodies and in our communities what's happening now in 2020 versus 2010. If we can remember that back that far, 2015. And we all can sense the change. We can all kind of predict why changes are getting faster. Is it all Twitter? You know, I don't know, but it's part of it, and it's part of when new beings are born. So when millennials are born, and they are constantly stimulated by screens, and then the iGens, the younger ones, have smartphones when they're 3 or 4. They're doing this thing. Their brain chemistry is different. Their development is different, and they operate differently. When I'm at rainbow or earth frequency or lightning in a bottle or whatever, I notice they work differently. So in my day, back in my day, if I was to come into a talk or a show or something I really wanted to see, I would look around for a free seat for me. What I noticed with the 23-year-olds at Lightning in a Bottle, they come in and they check out all the people that are there, all the other millennials. And then they make eye contact with a group that then invites them in. And then when the talk is done, they're all standing there and they have their phones out, and something comes in and they move like schooling fish in one direction. And then the school of fish moves into another direction. Because they're constantly referencing others. Because perhaps that was their parenting, social media, that's their community. They're really different. And they speak in fast clipped phrases, over top of each other, over top of each other. Their language has changed. They are the front edge of evolution. Just look around and see how they operate. So you could do all these theories about this is happening in a 24-hour news cycle and then this is whatever, but all of this is in the young people because they're going to push the whole system. And that's why I just want to connect with them all the time. That's what we're doing at Ancient Oaks, at our little retreat center. It's all millennials and me living there. And then they bring their groups in. And the way they do group, the way they do their medicines or their elixirs is very different than what we did, like what Mark and I might have done. It's really different. It's evolution underway. And you know, one of the Travis who came a couple of years ago, we had this thing, we had a salon called Chemical Consciousness. And this is sort of on the dark side of this thing. And Travis's job, so he took Ritalin, he took Adderall, the whole thing. He was like dosed by the system and his parents for just being a little spacey or something. But it changed his development. And so now at age 22, he got a degree in psychology and he counsels 15-year-olds who have been being dosed by these hard methamphetamines. He helps them because they're losing access to empathy and they're changing. It'll be considered one of the greatest criminal acts of the 21st century. There'll be lots of prosecutions. It's kind of like the opioid epidemic, you know, how dare they do this, right? Someone has to be responsible. So anyway, I said to Travis, I said, well, yeah, this all makes sense, and it's your job to help your younger to survive the chemical onslaught. But what happens when they grow up? What happens when they create the future? He said, I'm sorry to tell you, you are already living in their world. Facebook, Twitter, all that thing is made by us. I was dosed when I was 12. That is my consciousness. That is what made those companies. That is what make these platforms. You are living in their reality now. So it was like, oh. Now the interesting thing about that generation, they're super beings at some level, but they need guidance into emotion and healing some of their wounds, but they can heal super fast. They're self-aware, they're doing yoga and practices, they know about all this stuff already. They just need mentorship and guidance, and they need compassion. They need to feel compassion, not just stimulation, but compassion. And I really feel that. It's really, if we give them compassion, they'll be fine, you know. So I don't know where I was going with that. We can take another question.
So I just wanted clarity on your trip back to the beginning of life itself, and the answer was, all that is became big enough to produce this. Could that be extended to, and then we became conscious enough for self-awareness, and so on and so on? It's a simple.
Yeah, I think it's a joint. That's beautifully said. I think that the consciousness that is in the cosmos is rising from and with us.
Stuart Hameroff's, quantum microtubule theory isn't really relevant, is what I heard you say over there. It's we are generating it. It's not.
It's unsatisfying.
Yeah.
So for example, for about 30 or 40 years at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, that you guys might know about, they have been doing this research on person to object. So Dean Radin was doing like remote viewing and all that. You probably studied some of that. And I just went up and reviewed all their research because I was their keynote speaker at their conference this year, and they invited me to come and review the whole research program. What I'm proposing to them is it's system to system where you get the coherent effects that are kind of paranormal. It's not like that glass of water now has been blessed so it's more effective, because as opposed to what Hameroff and Penrose are saying, bare matter substrates aren't sophisticated. They can't carry something like consciousness. You need a substrate to run that on. Just like for software, you need to have a sophisticated computer to run it on. And life itself is sophisticated enough to run a really big, impressive field. And what I feel quite strongly is that those that are proposing that, well, just bare naked atoms are conscious, I would say to them, go to Mars. If you go and stand on the moon or Mars, you don't feel a darn thing. It is a dead environment. We have evolved inside this field. When you go outside, when you talk to astronauts, like I worked with 3 Apollo moonwalkers, and they're like, ho. When you're standing there, it is so different, because all around you is a dead world that's always been dead. And so it's made by life. And if the other thing that sort of bugs me about all that is it's a denial of life itself. Because they're saying, no, God is now atoms that are, and they predate life and they're sentient and all that. And like, well, what about life? And it's almost always these theories are proposed by my colleagues in the reductionist, very mental world, who aren't very embodied. So they're doing everything from here. Everything's PowerPoint bullets. And they take people on a nice trip and tell them a nice story, but they don't embody it. Their whole being is not part of the question. So I think they get a really thin shard of an answer that's often, it's unsatisfying and incomplete. And if they only embrace life, life would teach them everything about, and they may not have to ask the question, what is consciousness? Why are we asking this question? What we really need is, we need to, be more of it. We need to have more compassion, not more figuring out, perhaps. I don't know.
Bruce, just jumping on from that idea of ever-increasing complexity giving rise to self-consciousness, would that then, if that's predicated on organic life, would that rule out the possibility of transhuman or artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I was pointing out earlier, there's all this panic about artificial intelligence, but I have to tell you guys, don't worry about a thing. All it is a bunch of database correlation calls. It's like super crude. Nothing's going to wake up and crawl out and, trade stocks and become the richest thing in the world. None of that's going to happen. If you go to the people who actually build machine learning systems, they're like, this is so hard. And we're using 80s technology. It's just a shit ton of linear algebra. And it looks like magic, but it's so brittle. And Ray Kurzweil is wrong. He's absolutely wrong. So is Elon. Because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand biological systems. They've got that Silicon Valley hubris thing going. And in 2001, I wrote, Ray hired me to do the numbers for his upcoming Singularity book. And I thought, oh no, more of this nonsense, right? And I talked to Jaron Lanier, who's a mutual friend of ours, and Jaron was like so annoyed by all this bullshit. And this was in 2001. And it just keeps coming back. It's like the Terminator. We can't kill this nonsense thinking about AI and singularities. You just can't kill it. I couldn't kill it for Terence. I tried. Stayed up all night at Terence's house like, Terence, this is the difference between your Mac, which hasn't even got OS 10 on it, it's a single process, single tasking thing. And this a glass of water, this glass of water with atoms that is doing more processing in parallel. This is what life lives in. It doesn't go through a dumb 68,000 processor. And everything in computing is so limited and broken and not biological. And we're projecting way too much on it. It's very fragile, friable technology that ain't going to get up and walk anytime soon. And so Ray hired me. And so I said to Ray, I'll generate you the increasing GPU, graphics processing numbers, you can use in your book for your curves, because CPUs generally aren't a good measure of that. So I did that, and then I wrote an essay to him saying, this is meaningless information. And you cannot conclude that because GPUs are getting faster that somehow software will write itself and become intelligent and et cetera, et cetera. It's nonsense. And as an engineer, he's not really a scientist, he hasn't have any training. You should know better. You're gonna like get the muggles to get all upset and stuff like that. And so the book came out, and I had lunch with him. He gave me we had a nice lunch and everything, and no comment on the thing, because it's a kind of a religious thing, really, but it's annoying. And we get this over and over again, and now it's back, and now it's this and that, and people who work in the field are like, oh, please, the systems are so broken. So the meetings we had at Google were like, Google saying, we know they're broken. How do we make software more like life? And the proposal I made to them was, we have to throw everything out. Johnny von Neumann's designs from 1951, they got to go. We have to build compute fields. We have to invest $1 trillion in building a new compute platform that behaves like a natural system. And then we have to baby it and feed it and watch the evolution go and decide how to make it work. And it's possible that these companies can do it if I can get them excited enough. So by mid-century, we have a brand new computing platform that can tackle climate change issues. It's so powerful that it can take giant data like every piece of data from Australia and predict when and where wildfires would happen. Beautiful systems like that in the 50s, or how to ameliorate for fires on a continent-wide scale. So, it's just annoying. I mean, just not again. I mean, we need to have less noise and fantasy and more reality. I know I'm on a freaking high horse right now, but.
That sounds like a good point to leave it then. So, unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but if Bruce is happy to chat to people on the other side of the glass windows, there's a good place to hang out after we've set up. So a big thanks to Dr. Bruce DAMER.